Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, President of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and I'm joined today by Peter Jaworski. He's an associate professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where he teaches ethics to business students.
That's right.
Peter, Peter, you have a long history of doing research on why markets matter, and in fact, you have an incredibly compelling talk on why you should be able to sell your kidneys, which I hope people Google and watch because I love it. A couple of years ago, I started to notice that you were really getting into the topic of paying blood donors for their donation. And I actually asked you to write an article for our magazine, which we actually put on the cover a few years ago, so winter of 2018. But since then, we've seen quite a bit change. Obviously, COVID happened, new governments were elected in different provinces. So now we're back in the thick of things. Peter, you're back in the thick of things in Alberta in particular, really leading a one-man campaign to convince governments to let donors be compensated for giving their blood. So before I start by asking you some questions, I think it's worth noting that I don't know if it's a victim or a beneficiary of brain drain, depending on how you want to look at it. Peter's a Canadian who lives and teaches in the US, although he's probably, in my estimation, doing more for the cause of enhancing and improving Canadians' healthcare than many professors, especially any ethics professors at Canadian universities. So thank you for doing that for Canadians.
Well, thank you for that generous and kind introduction, Scott. Thanks.
Well, it's most deserved. So let me start with a question for you that I think really confused me for a while. I know I use the term blood donors off the top. And indeed, I actually think I made you change some language in your article you wrote for us a couple of years ago to, talk about blood instead of plasma. But there actually, now I'm learning more that there is quite a bit of difference between blood and plasma. Do you just want to start there with us and just explain what is the difference between blood and plasma?
Yeah, sure. So plasma is a part of your blood. It's the majority of your blood. It's the yellow, straw-colored part of your blood. It's the part of your blood that's mostly water, but it also carries the proteins to different parts of your body. So when you donate blood, you donate both. When you donate whole blood, you're donating plasma as well, but there's a separate procedure that you can use. It's called plasmapheresis, where we can take out all of your blood, we spin it in a machine, we separate out the plasma while you're sitting in the chair, and then we keep the plasma and we return the blood to you. By the way, for the people watching on YouTube or whatever, this is a container. So people listening to the podcast can't see this, but I'm holding up a container that is used to capture plasma. And the look on Scott's face says that it's a very large container. It is a very large container.
Well, so how much? So what would be, in terms of taking out blood for an average donation, what would they take out for blood versus what do they take out for plasma? Like how much
So
volume?
they can take out about 800 milliliters of plasma so it's about 810 milliliters. It depends on your weight, a number of other factors too. And they take out, I think it's about 600 milliliters, but I could be wrong about that when it comes to whole blood.
Okay, so then the plasma, so they would take out more of it total and then put some back in, so they keep 800. So they might take out
Yeah,
more
they
than
keep
that.
800 milliliters and then they return the red and white blood cells as well as the platelets back to you. This is why, by the way, you can donate plasma so much more often than you can donate blood. You can give blood once every 56 days, but you can donate plasma in Canada and in the United States. You can donate plasma twice a week with 48 hours in between, right? So
Wow.
that's a lot.
That's a lot of free cookies. Well, we'll get to that. And
But I
so,
should say, Scott, if
yeah.
I may, that Canadian Blood Services policy is to allow one plasma donation per week if you're male, and I think it's one every 2 weeks if you're female. So
Oh,
Health Canada sets the standard. Health Canada has set a standard where you are legally permitted to donate twice a week with 48 hours in between, but Canadian Blood Services has a separate policy where they only accept donations at a much reduced rate.
so if they're taking out more and they're having to spin it and put stuff back in, it must take longer to donate plasma. Is that right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So it'll take, 30 to 45 minutes to donate whole blood, but it can take up to 2 hours to donate plasma because, as you've said, you've got to sit in that chair and the blood has to spin and the plasma gets separated. And the process is they take out blood, they spin it, keep the plasma, they return red and white blood cells as well as the platelets, and it goes back and forth like that.
Interesting. So I guess I know what blood is mostly used for. So, transfusions and for car accidents and surgeries and whatnot, but what is plasma used for?
Yeah, so plasma is also used for trauma victims, and we can use plasma for transfusions. So for example, in the midst of this pandemic, you've probably heard a lot about blood plasma used for transfusions, right? But what we can also do with plasma is we can separate out the individual proteins within that plasma. This process is called fractionation, right? And we separate out those individual proteins, proteins like albumin, clotting factor, and most, I want to say most useful, but it's the protein used most frequently, immune globulin. And immune globulin is just a fancy name for an antibody. So now you should have a sense of what we use those proteins for. We use albumin in trauma victims and burn victims. It helps to replace some of that, some of that fluid. We use clotting factor for people who have blood that doesn't clot very well. So people who have hemophilia, for example, a number of other issues with your blood clotting properly. And then we use immune globulin for a whole range of different possible ailments. We use it for primary and autoimmune deficiencies or disorders. So people whose body doesn't create antibodies the way yours does, the way mine does, those people get regular infusions of immune globulin, and immune globulin just is the antibodies from other people. And so it allows those people to live their lives more or less normally.
So I guess how much blood plasma is required annually by Canadians, and how do we get it?
The volumes are really large. So I'll give you an example. Canadian Blood Services has a plan to reach 50% self-sufficiency in immune globulin, just one of those proteins that I told you about. In order to accomplish that, they need to collect 600,000 liters via the plasmapheresis method, right? 600,000 liters, plus 200,000 liters of recovered plasma. Recovered plasma is when we take a whole blood donation. And then after you've donated it, we then separate it out and keep the plasma from that. So we need 200,000 liters plus 600,000 liters. So we need 800,000 liters in order to reach 50% self-sufficiency. So each year, more or less, we need 1.6 million liters of plasma. Where do we get that plasma? Well, we don't get it from Canada, right? We don't get it from Canadian donors. Overwhelmingly, over 80%, in fact, of the plasma therapies that we use are made with plasma from American donors, right? That's where we get it.
So if I'm if I go into like a blood donor clinic set up in the junior high gymnasium, I mean when they start letting those things happen again, now would I be donating blood or plasma or both, or only one of them?
You'd be donating both. Those are whole blood donations. Canadian Blood Services will take that whole blood donation. Sometimes they will use it for transfusions, like they'll transfuse the whole blood. But sometimes they will separate out the parts, and that is how we, at the moment, get most of our plasma.
But they're not putting it back, like at my local clinic here, or my local blood donor clinic. They're not injecting it back into after spinning it. They're just taking.
No, they're not. No, they take the whole blood. You go home. You wait 56 days, hopefully, and you do it again, right? I hope most Canadians. I know most Canadians don't do that, but I hope a lot of people do that regularly. But we take the whole blood. We don't have plasmapheresis machines at your local high school.
Right. So I guess I'm jumping ahead here, maybe, but you mentioned we're getting it most from the U.S. So is that like Canadians? Do you have data on how many Canadians donate blood, like on what percentage or how often?
The percentages are quite small. It's less than 3%. In the United States, it's about 3%. These are regular blood donors in Canada. So the numbers are fairly small. A lot of people do give blood, once a year, or maybe once every 5 years or something like that, or maybe even like once in their lives, right? So we're talking about fairly small number of regular blood donors. And it would be good if we increase that number.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so one way they do that in the States is to pay their donors. I mean, not exclusively. Sure, there's some that do voluntary donations in the U.S. But what would
Scott, can I
your
interrupt you,
yeah,
Scott? Can I tell
absolutely
you?
you can.
So the American system is really interesting because in America, they don't pay for blood. So
Hmm.
when you give a whole blood donation, you don't get paid for it. It's not illegal in the United States, but hospitals don't want it. It's the regulation, the requirement is that you have to label blood that has been paid for, that a donor gives in exchange for money, and hospitals simply don't buy that. So the practice in the United States is to not pay people for blood donations. The only thing that they do pay for, what they do pay for, is plasma donations through plasmapheresis, plasma that is then turned into those plasma protein products, right? The plasma therapies, if you're donating plasma for that purpose, then it's a common practice in the United States to pay donors. And here we're talking about really large numbers every single year, something like, I don't even want to hazard a guess, but it's millions of Americans sell their plasma every single year.
Hmm. Okay, so what would they earn? Like, what would a typical plasma donor earn for their once a week or twice a week donation?
So it averages to be about $40 to $50 per donation. But different centers have different policies and they also have different plans. So for example, a common plan would be to give you $30 for your first donation. Then it goes up to $80 for your second donation. There's a really good reason for that. I can explain if you'd like. Then it goes down to like $20 for your next 3 donations, and then $50 for your 6th or 7th donation. So there's a kind of pattern, and that pattern is intended to get you to donate, the full amount. And the reason why the second donation you get paid so much more for than all the other donations is because for purposes of safety, the plasma centers will only take your plasma and turn it into a plasma therapy if you donate a second time. So your first donation, they hold and they wait until you donate a second time. And the reason why they do that is because many viruses have a window period, so we might get your plasma, we test it, right? But there may be viruses that are within the window period. So the thought is that if we wait, get your second donation, test both of those for the presence of viruses, we will increase the likelihood that there is no pathogen, no virus in there by a lot. And then we take both of those and we send them off for fractionation.
That's really interesting. I had no idea. And
so
so
you can make like $300 to $400 a month donating plasma in the United States.
And so, and how many? I guess how many people? Is it still 3%? You said are regular donors. Does that include plasma in the U.S.?
No, it's higher. I'm not going to know the number off the top of my head, but it's quite a lot higher. There are millions, like I said, of Americans that donate plasma, and they donate regularly in the United States.
And so the U.S., they have enough plasma that they can sell to Canada and other countries?
Not only do they have enough plasma for themselves, they have such a huge volume of plasma is collected in the United States. The United States is responsible for over 70% of the entire world's supply of plasma used to make these plasma therapies. Over 70%. I mean, just to give you a sense of the kinds of numbers that we're talking about here, we're talking about 1.6% of total exports from the United States is this plasma or plasma therapies, right? 1.6%. It's the 11th largest industry in the United States. At the moment, it's more than $27 billion, and it's expected to reach between 35 and 44 billion by 2025 or 2026. So we're talking about in 5 years, it's going to be basically a $40 billion industry in the United States. It's huge. It's unbelievable.
And you mentioned they're supplying 70% of the world. So are there other countries that allow paid plasma donations in the world?
Yes, there are. There is a handful of them. The one that started it all is Austria, and Austria permits payment for plasma donations. Germany does as well. Both Austria and Germany export plasma. There's also Czechia, or the Czech Republic. They legalized paying for plasma in 2008, and now they are self-sufficient, and they are in a position to export some of that plasma as well. And then rounding out is Hungary, which also allows payment. China also permits payment, but China is a strange case. I can't get data from China. It's hard to know exactly what's going on in China. And so they're not part of like the global system, although they do import albumin from the United States, which is one specific kind of plasma therapy. But it's illegal for them to import any of the other kinds of plasma therapy. So only albumin is imported to China.
You mentioned Czechia, Czech Republic, now being self-sufficient. So prior to 2008, and I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, do you know they weren't self-sufficient?
No, they were not.
What percentage were they supplying locally, I guess, through unpaid?
Prior to 2008, we're talking about 30 to 40%, maybe less than that even, of the demand for the plasma therapies was met by domestic plasma donations in Czechia, I think it's pronounced. After they legalized it, and within 3 years, the volume of plasma donations increased sevenfold. There was a sevenfold increase in plasma donations. And by the way, and this is kind of important too, the increase in plasma donations came not just from the paid plasma sector, but also the unpaid plasma. So there was an increase in unpaid plasma in Czechia after the change in the law, and the amount of blood donations that were given in Czechia remained flat. So there was basically no effect on the unpaid blood donation system. There was an increase in unpaid plasma donation, as well as a very significant increase, obviously, in paid plasma donations.
Wow, that is, I think that would go against what people would assume, that you're gonna steal some of the market, you're gonna drive people away who see it being a community service thing to now being, you know, something that's a paid service. That's really fascinating. That's really,
and you've touched, by the way, Scott, on the most important and significant potential objection to allowing more provinces in Canada to permit paying people for plasma, namely the impact that would have on unpaid whole blood donations. Right? This has been a concern that's been raised by all of the national blood operators, including by Canadian Blood Services. And the concern is really intuitive. It's like if you have the option of either selling your plasma for, you know, $40, $50, or you can give your blood and get, as you said, you know, cookies and some orange juice or something. Like, what are you going to do? It's funny, I asked that of people, and everybody says, well, I'm not interested in selling my plasma. Everyone that I've spoken to, or very many people, say, I'm not interested in selling my plasma. I would just go ahead and donate blood for free. However, then I say, well, then why are you concerned? And they say, well, it's not about me, it's about all these other people. And it's like everybody else is, of course, going to go for the money, right? Rather than donate out of the kindness of their hearts. So that is the most important objection in my mind. There are other objections that I think are a little bit less important. And the experience of the Czech Republic or Czechia is really enlightening on this score. We see that there is no, sometimes it's called encroachment, sometimes it's called crowding out. You don't really see a negative effect on whole blood donations. This is consistent in Germany too. In Germany, we didn't see a decrease in blood donations in the presence of the paid plasma sector. And I've conducted a study, an empirical test of the effect of the introduction of paid plasma, not just in Canada, but also in the United States. So we have data from the 3 cities in Canada that have paid plasma operations. And we found that the paid plasma industry had no effect on unpaid blood donations in those 3 cities. We also matched those with 3 cities in the United States that also saw the introduction of paid plasma around the same time period. We're talking about 2016, 2017. And we found similarly that there was no effect. And so if you put all of this together, I have a kind of answer as to why we shouldn't expect a negative impact on blood donations. The most important, I think, answer is that we are attracting different individuals, different demographics, different groups of people. The kinds of people that are interested in donating their blood are not the kinds of people that are interested in selling their plasma. Or rather, if you drew like a Venn diagram, the overlap would be very small. The kinds of people that are attracted to the opportunity to like make a little bit of extra money by selling their plasma are not the same people that are interested in giving their blood for free. That's true within individuals, but it's also true like over time. So when you are a student, you might be drawn to selling your plasma in order to be able to buy books or for other reasons. But then as you get older, you might no longer be interested in that. And so you might start donating blood. I have anecdotal evidence that that's true for at least some of the people that I've spoken to. So that I think is the most important objection to allowing provinces like Alberta, like Ontario, like British Columbia, like Quebec, and so on to permit paying Canadians for plasma rather than that, what we've been doing, which is we pay Americans for their plasma, right? And we have a ban on paying Canadians.
Well, that's sorry. I guess I should jump in, and I want to come back to your about who's donating. I want to come back to that in a little bit, but I think maybe we should answer the question as to what is the current situation. Like you mentioned, there are 3 cities that allow it. You mentioned some provinces that don't. So this is not like there's not like a Canadian-wide ban on paying donors for plasma. So break it down. How does it work by province?
So it's a provincial and territorial jurisdiction. And Quebec has made it illegal to pay for blood and plasma since, I'm going to say it's 1994. It could be 1997. So they've had a long-standing prohibition. Ontario banned it in 2014. Alberta followed suit in 2017. British Columbia passed a ban in 2018. So those are the 4 provinces where there is a ban. Everywhere else, it's not illegal. So it is legal to pay people for plasma donations in those other provinces and in those territories, yeah.
So which 3 cities can you currently get paid for your plasma?
So the oldest one is in Winnipeg, and there has been a plasma center there since 1984. It used to be called CanGene, now it's called Prometic Plasma Resources. It used to collect a specialty type of plasma exclusively. So there are infants who have Rh disease, which is like the blood of the mother and the blood of the baby. They don't match, and so the mother's body will attack the baby. But you can donate a specialty kind of plasma, and that treatment will prevent Rh disease. And it saves a lot of babies' lives, right? So they collected that specialty type of plasma from 1984 until 2017. In 2017, they opened it up and now they collect all plasma types. I don't know why this has generated so much confusion in the public debate over paying for plasma, but people have said that like, oh, something weird is happening in Winnipeg. No, nothing weird is happening in Winnipeg. Winnipeg collects all plasma types. They no longer do the specialty plasma. So that's Winnipeg. In Saskatoon, Canadian Plasma Resources opened a plasma collection center in 2016. And then they have also that same company, Canadian Plasma Resources, also operates a plasma collection center in Moncton, New Brunswick. And those are the 3 centers that we have.
Interesting. So I guess as you've talked about, over 80% of our plasma supply is coming from the US. Is that, I mean, you talked about, I guess, objections, but is that safe? Like we had a tainted blood scandal in the 80s that was, that has caused obviously deaths. So are we safe using their blood?
Yeah, we absolutely are. In fact, every national blood operator all over the world has said that plasma therapies made from paid plasma are just as safe as plasma therapies made from the plasma of people who are not paid for their plasma donations. And the reason why it's safe is because of all the different steps that we can use on plasma that we cannot use on whole blood used for transfusions. So we can heat treat plasma in the process of fractionating it into the individual plasma protein products or therapies, right? So we can heat treat it or pasteurize it, right? We can use solvents and detergents, and the solvents and detergents are the most important aspect of this. They basically kill all kinds of viruses, especially ones that are lipid enveloped, which means they have an oily outer layer, just like soap, right? We're being told to wash our hands during coronavirus. Why? Well, the reason why is because SARS-CoV-2 has a lipid envelope. They have an oily outer body. And when you add soap, it destroys that oily outer body and destroys the virus. Solvents and detergents work in the same kind of way. We can also use nanofiltration. So viruses have different sizes from some of the proteins, and we can use really tiny holes that like allow the proteins through but keep the viruses back. So we can do all of these things when it comes to plasma in order to make these plasma therapies, something we can't do when it comes to whole blood, right? It would kill the stuff that we need for purposes of transfusion. And all of those steps have made plasma protein therapies inordinately safe. Right, inordinately safe. There's always a risk because blood and plasma will always be, I think, risky, right? But that risk is really small. In over 25 years, there has not been a single transmission of any virus pathogen, of anything from a plasma protein therapy using modern processes. So it's safe.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Now, but when it comes to cost, I guess that's where we've been talking about this, and I find it just interesting anyways, but when why the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, I guess, would be interested in this topic is the dollars and cents. So if we're going to start, I mean, we're already paying Americans for their blood. I mean, surely isn't it cheaper just to get the money, or sorry, get the blood for free, the plasma for free from people who are donating? And I appreciate that maybe they're not doing it enough, but if we could somehow increase the number of people who are donating it for free, isn't that cheaper for taxpayers?
Yeah, so the answer to that is no.
Okay.
And let me explain why, because this is something that like a lot of people ask me this question. Let me first begin by saying that Canada is spending a lot of money on plasma therapies. So in 2017-18, I think we spent nearly 800 million. We redid our contracts, and so now we're spending less, but we're still spending over 600 million. Demand for these plasma therapies is increasing by 6 to 10% per year. So very soon we will be spending $1 billion per year paying Americans to donate their plasma, right? So we're talking about really large sums of money. It is not cheaper to ask people to donate blood and plasma for free than it is to pay people for plasma donations. And here's why. First, you've got basically the same infrastructure costs and similar employee costs, whether you're operating a paid plasma center or an unpaid Canadian Blood Services Center. Canadian Blood Services Centers are more expensive to operate, but we're not talking about large sums. Employees are more expensive for Canadian Blood Services. So you've got that as a fixed cost. Every year you have to pay a certain amount for the same number of staff, for the rent on the building, for the electricity, and so on. However, in every unpaid plasma center can expect to collect approximately 20,000 liters of plasma per year. Compare that to the United States, where the average plasma center collects 60,000 liters per year. And you start to begin to see the staggering effect of volume on the fixed cost, right? So you start dividing 60,000 liters versus 20,000 liters by your total fixed costs, and you're starting to get a cheaper per liter price. More than that too, also important is that the amount of marketing and advertising that you have to do is very different. So if you are paying people to donate their plasma, not only will they come without needing a lot of advertising, they will also tell their friends about it, and they will bring their friends. And so you basically don't have to spend a lot of resources advertising and marketing. Compare that to like Canadian Blood Services, which has to have a very large national marketing and advertising budget. In Canada, we prefer to give our money to marketing like businesses and the marketing industry than we do to the donors whose plasma it is, right? We prefer to spend that money on big, impressive advertising campaigns. So advertising costs are also important, but it's basically the volume as compared to the fixed cost that makes such a big difference. To give you some concrete numbers, Canadian Blood Services has asked for $855 million in order to open and operate 40 unpaid plasma collection centers, right? The provinces have not yet dedicated that sum of money, but they are beginning with 3 plasma collection centers. 2 of them, I think, are already open, and 1 should be open at the end of this year. So that's a one-time $855 million. That's going to take us over 7 years to open and operate these 40 plasma centers. Canadian Blood Services then wants an ongoing $247 million per year budget in order to continue operating those 40 unpaid plasma collection centers. Now, I've done the math. I've ignored all of the infrastructure and the startup costs, all of those. And I'm just looking at the $247 million per year. And if you divide that by the expected 600,000 liters of plasma to be collected from those 40 sites, you get a total of $412 per liter. So that's how much it's going to cost us to collect a liter, $412 per liter.
A free
The
liter.
international price of raw plasma is between $220 to $260 per liter. So already it's basically twice as expensive given the expectations of Canadian Blood Services. I think those expectations might be a little bit rosy, and I suspect that they won't collect quite that much plasma, but it's possible. It's possible that they might, and I suspect it'll be more expensive than $412 per liter. My guess is that it'll be around $450 to $460 per liter. Canadian Plasma Resources.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Scott.
No, I was say, so just to be clear, a free liter, a donated liter, forgetting what the $1 billion in startup costs, is $412 a liter, or we could pay an American $220 to $260 for theirs.
Well, we can also pay Canadians that amount,
right? Okay,
because those three centers, Canadian Plasma Resources has, ever since they tried to open in Ontario, actually the law against paying people for plasma. It's because this new company back in 2012 announced this plan to open 10 plasma centers across Canada, beginning with 3 in Ontario. The Ontario government responded to that by passing the Voluntary Blood Donations Act under pressure from the public sector unions in 2014. But like I said, Canadian Plasma Resources has managed to open 2 paid plasma centers in Canada. And since the very beginning, they've been offering all of their plasma to Canadian Blood Services. Back in 2017, they offered it at $166 per liter. $166 per liter. They have since issued 2 additional contracts. The last one that I'm aware of is, I think it's $220 per liter. And they're offering it to Canadian Blood Services. They're offering a 20-year contract, which is unheard of, right? With first right of refusal by Canadian Blood Services. I have no idea why Canadian Blood Services is not accepting this contract. Instead, Canadian Blood Services is sort of making this company send Canadian plasma abroad.
Well, that's remarkable. Wow. So you're talking about Canadian Blood Services, and you mentioned all the money that they want to spend and what they've requested. So who gives them their budget? Like, where do they get their money from?
Yeah, so they're funded by the provincial and territorial governments, basically proportionately. So their annual budget comes from the Alberta Treasury, it comes from the Manitoba Treasury, it comes from the Ontario Treasury, it comes from the provincial and territorial governments.
Huh. Okay, so taxpayers are footing the bill for these things. Okay,
yes, they are. Yes,
and that's why this should matter to taxpayers, in my view.
And the plasma protein therapy budget is the largest item for Canadian Blood Services.
Huh. So now I've heard the NDP in Alberta claim that if Albertans were allowed to sell their plasma to a paid private plasma clinic, all that plasma would be sold off by the company to foreign countries. Is that accurate?
The answer is yes and no. So Canadian Blood Services does purchase products from Prometic Plasma Resources. And so some of the plasma that Canadians are paid for in Winnipeg does end up in therapies that are used by Canadians. Canadian Plasma Resources, on the other hand, when they opened in Saskatoon, they initially only received Health Canada approval, right? And the way that the international plasma, the global plasma industry operates, is that if you want to use plasma therapies from a paid plasma center, that center needs to be approved by Health Canada. So all of the American plasma centers where we get our therapies, they have Health Canada approval on top of FDA approval, which is the American equivalent, and on top of the European Medicines Authority, or EMA. I forget exactly what it stands for, but you have to get that approval too if you want to sell the products made from your plasma into the European market. So Canadian Plasma Resources, when they first opened, they only sought Health Canada approval, meaning that all of the plasma that they collected could only be used in Canada. So they were anticipating selling all of their plasma to Canadian Blood Services and nowhere else. Otherwise, they would have sought this regulatory approval. Canadian Blood Services turned down the contract, and the explanation that they gave at the time was that Canadian Plasma Resources just doesn't collect large enough volumes. I think they were collecting like 20 or 30 or 40,000 liters per year, but we need 1.2 million liters. So Canadian Blood Services was like, we're not going to do it because the volumes are too small. And so Canadian Plasma Resources had to rush out and get FDA approval and European Medicines Authority approval in order to be able to sell the plasma into the European and into the American market. One thing to say about the NDP's criticism is, look, we have been relying on the global plasma industry as Canadians. Where do we get our plasma from? From Americans, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe it's time for us to repay the Americans to participate, to reciprocate in the global plasma industry. So I'm not even concerned that a lot of the plasma is going to be sold into the American and the European markets. That's okay with me because there are patients in Europe that also need these therapies. My sister lives in Amsterdam, right? And I see no reason why we shouldn't contribute to the global plasma supply. The second thing that I will say, however, in response, is that just as I explained, the volumes were so small, but Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec together make up about 85% of Canada's population. So if one of those provinces, Alberta, for example, if they were to eliminate the hypocritical law that bans paying Albertans for plasma donations, then the volume of plasma that can be collected by whatever plasma companies decide to enter into Alberta, and I definitely know that Canadian Plasma Resources will immediately open a number of plasma collection centers, then we're talking about a very sizable volume. At that point, it makes no sense for Canadian Blood Services not to accept those contracts. So I expect that plasma to stay in Canada because I expect Canadian Blood Services to do the right thing as far as taxpayers are concerned, and to do what is more efficient and more economical, right? And not try to collect more expensive plasma in places, well, I mean, they should still actually continue to try to collect plasma. It's important that the volumes continue to increase, but nevertheless, they will be able to lower the cost, at least somewhat, by purchasing that plasma from Alberta. And then the last thing that I will say about it is this. At the moment, Canadian Plasma Resources sells its plasma to, I think it's a German company called Biotest AG. Canadian Blood Services does not have a contract. They do not receive plasma therapies from that specific fractionator, from that specific company. However, in the future, Canadian Plasma Resources might have a contract with some of the companies that Canadian Blood Services has contracts with. At that point, Canadian plasma will be returning in the form of plasma therapies to deal with Canadian patients. So it's a matter of time. We will be using that plasma. The NDP is wrong.
So I guess not that I wanted a shorter answer, but a short answer could be that yes, technically it's going to foreign countries, but almost only because Canadian Blood Services won't buy it.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely the reason. There's no other reason.
Yeah,
Canadian Plasma Resources isn't preferring to send the plasma abroad rather than keep it here in Canada.
sure. So
Yeah.
what you mentioned, and so you mentioned potential repeal. So what's happening in Alberta right now? Is there's a move to repeal this a lot of ban private donations or paid private donations?
Yes, there is a movement afoot. MLA Tanny Yao has put forward a private members bill called the Voluntary Blood Donations Repeal Act. It has gotten all the way through second reading. So it passed first reading and it passed second reading. All that's standing in the way of that becoming the law is third reading, which we anticipate either at the end of October or sometime in early November. And my hope is that Alberta will pass it.
And what would change? Like what if we get one province? You said that we'll see. There'll be stuff coming in. Like what can we expect as Albertans to see if this is repealed?
So if the Voluntary Blood Donations Act is repealed, I would expect basically immediately for 3 to 5 plasma centers to open in Alberta. So we would be talking about approximately 200 jobs, right? And these are high quality jobs that we're talking about. And we're talking about, I think, somewhere on the order of $100 to $200 million in investment pouring into Alberta, and that's just in the short run. In the long run, I would expect a much larger investment. I would anticipate and expect approximately 1,000 jobs to be created in the province of Alberta. There may be a possibility for a fractionation center to be opened in Alberta. If so, then we would be talking about $500 million just for the fractionation facility, up to $1 billion and over 1,000 jobs there as well. So I would expect this to have a very strong and very significant positive effect on the local economies of Calgary in particular and Edmonton, I would expect as well, possibly also Red Deer. So that would be my expectation.
And what about Ontario? That you mentioned they have the ban. Is there any consideration there to repeal it? I mean, that's the big dog in the country and where we would probably see the most likely supply.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I haven't really seen much except the Ontario Public Service Employees Union did issue a press release saying, hey, Ontario, don't even think about repealing this law, right? And so that makes me think that maybe something's happening in Ontario. I really hope something is in fact happening in Ontario. I will say that when they passed the Voluntary Blood Donations Act in Ontario in 2014, Ontario lost $400 million of investment and nearly 1,000 jobs. So passing the ban, and by the way, we went from being 40% self-sufficient in plasma for plasma therapies back around 2014. Now we are down to 13.5%.
Wow.
So nothing has changed in Ontario except we are using more and more American paid plasma in Ontario. So we passed the ban for what end, right? It's 6 years later and we are still almost entirely reliant on American paid plasma. Ontario, given the population, it's about half. Ontario provides about half of the budget to Canadian Blood Services. They spend about half of the total, right? So it's really large sums of money that we're talking about in Ontario.
You mentioned the government employees unions issuing this warning. Now, their interest, I guess I'm just guessing here, but their interest is that they have the jobs at the current Canadian Blood Services setups. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. Canadian Blood Services is required to hire people from the public sector employees unions. Yeah.
Okay. So so that's they're very self-interested. They'd be happy to see a few of their jobs protected with the purchase of American blood. That's okay in their view.
Yeah. The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
Because you don't see opposition by unions to paid plasma in the United States or in Germany or anywhere else, in fact. But in Canada, because Canadian Blood Services is staffed by public sector union employees. If there's a ban, as there is in Ontario, the amount of pressure that there is on the provincial governments in order to give this money to Canadian Blood Services to open additional plasma centers, it would grow. And it has grown. It continues to grow. We are in an unsustainable situation, Scott. It's really bad, right? And the coronavirus has only made it worse. I'll tell you in a second why I'm expecting a shortage of plasma therapies at the beginning of 2021, right? But we simply, this cannot continue. We need to collect more plasma in Canada. My preference is for it to be done via the private commercial sector, but we need Canadian Blood Services to do it as well. So the pressure is there, and if they could pass these bans and they succeeded in the larger provinces in Canada, then that puts additional pressure on provincial governments to dedicate more money to them. And if they open these 40 unpaid plasma centers, then that's more unionized employees for the various public sector unions. It's more dues, it's more representation. Yeah.
No, they're obviously activating against you. I mean, I've seen there's other ones too. Saw online. There's lobby groups like Blood Watch. What's Blood Watch? Like a bunch of doctors concerned about safety, or what is that?
No, Blood Watch is not a bunch of doctors concerned about safety. Blood Watch was founded in the wake of the tainted blood scandal. It was founded by a playwright as well as a number of people who survived the greatest Canadian health tragedy that has ever occurred. And initially, right, it's an attempt to prevent a repeat of the tainted blood scandal. They described themselves as a public blood safety watchdog group. Although recently, for some reason, they've started to redescribe themselves as a patient organization. I don't know why, but that's the way they've described themselves. Blood Watch received significant funding from the public sector unions. This was an issue before the Alberta legislature. So in the discussions there, it was revealed that they get a lot of money, $20,000 from the Ontario Public Service Employees Union 1 year, and then $10,000 later. And then 5,000 from the Nova Scotia Union, and so on. So I think a majority of their funding comes from, although we don't know because they don't tell us, they keep their funding secret. They're a private organization. They're entitled to not be transparent if they don't want to be.
And so you dug up some information on, if I recall seeing this online, about their website registration.
Yeah, right. So this was actually the biggest. Yeah, this was. Yeah, not only that. I mean, look, it doesn't take much. You just have to Google in quotes, contribution to Blood Watch or donation to Blood Watch, and then you'll find the meetings where the Ontario Public Sector Employees Union, Ontario Public Service Employees Union gives money to Blood Watch. But I also discovered that their website was registered by OPSU, by the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. So from its founding in, I think it was 2016 until sometime 6 months ago, their website was registered by the founding organization was OPSU, which was really eye-opening to me.
Yeah, that's not very grassrootsy.
No.
Also, I think, it would be strange for for someone not to know how to register a website and rely on the local public sector union to do it for them. So that's I think it's pretty telling. Now, you mentioned you started talking about why you think we're going to be running into shortages around COVID and whatnot. Do you want to expand on how dire is the situation and what impact has COVID had on the supply and the need for plasma?
So it's a moving situation, and so I will say everything that I know, and then I will give my own opinion. But I want to be as careful as possible about this. So here's what we know: we know that plasma donations in the United States have decreased by at least 15 to 20% from March, April, May, I believe June and July as well. So 15 to 20% reduction in plasma donations in the country that supplies more than 70% of the entire world's plasma for these therapies. And that's at least the latest number that I heard was in fact a quarter, so 25%, right? But publicly, Canadian Blood Services said at one of their meetings that it's 15 to 20%. That's such a huge reduction in the volume of plasma collected. Now, it takes between 7 to 14 months for us to take the plasma through fractionation and to make the plasma therapies. So we have a window of between 7 to 14 months where the reduction in plasma donations in the United States will begin to be seen in a reduction in therapies, potentially. So, so a number of national blood operators are anticipating and are bracing for and taking steps to deal with a potential shortage in therapies. I should point out, by the way, that the people who need these therapies in order to live, they should have those therapies uninterrupted. They should have uninterrupted access. So we are talking about people who are using immune globulin experimentally, for example. They're sometimes described as like gray label or off-label uses of immune globulin. We should anticipate that to decrease quite a bit. People may also have to use lower volumes of their therapies and so on. So Canadian Blood Services has created a document, an interim emergency document to triage the situation. So I am expecting a shortage in 2021. I am hoping that plasma donations have increased now in the United States and hopefully more than in the past. And then we have one additional draw or potential demand on plasma. One use for plasma is convalescent plasma. That is people who have gone through, who have had the coronavirus. Presumably they have antibodies in their plasma. We are asking people to donate plasma so that we can transfuse that plasma into people who are suffering from the coronavirus right at this moment. That's probably going to be replaced by a hyperimmune globulin. A hyperimmune globulin is just finding the specific antibody that is useful, that is a response by the body to coronavirus. The people that recover, they create antibodies against this coronavirus. A hyperimmune globulin takes that specific antibody and isolates it and concentrates it, right? And then we can have a protein therapy that we can then give to people who have coronavirus. Demand for that, there's a Polish company called Biomed Lublin, who is the first to take hyperimmune globulin against SARS-CoV-2 to the clinical trial stage. There are other plasma companies in the United States and all over the world who are also working on this hyperimmune globulin. I expect us to be able to find that, and that's going to increase demand on plasma, right? So we're going to see an uptick in that direction. And as I said earlier, demand for these therapies is growing at 6 to 10% per year. This is already prior to SARS-CoV-2. In Australia, for example, if you look at their numbers over the years, it's like a 12% increase in like 2015, 16. I'm going to get these numbers roughly right, not precisely right, but like 12% increase, 11% increase, 10% increase. There was one year where they had a 7% increase. Now it's back up to a 10% increase. This is year over year. We can't keep up. We can't keep up. We need to collect a lot more plasma just to meet the demand that is currently growing. And there is nobody's predicting a stop to this growth. Nobody's saying that like, oh, it'll be 6 to 10% for the next 5 years and then it'll calm down. No, people are looking into the future and they're saying, well, this industry is going to double by like 2026. And then it's probably going to double again, 10 years after that.
Wow. That's more dire than I realized. So let's say I
want to end on a potentially rosy note, which is that like every one of these plasma companies has a certain amount of the plasma that they have like available in times of emergency. There is an outside possibility that plasma donations increase significantly, and so the shortage will be really brief. I will also say that the United States, supply and demand has always been on a knife's edge in this particular industry. So the amount of supply available to meet the demand, it's awfully close, and it has been for a long time. However, there has been a significant investment in the United States. They have gone from 299 plasma collection centers in 2006 to 601 plasma collection centers, so a doubling by 2016. Right now, it's at least 860 plasma collection centers and growing, right? So I think the United States is the center of this entire global industry, and I think they will be collecting a lot more plasma. So on a rosy note, it's possible that we'll see this shortage, but then a year or 2 years later, things will be fine, and we will in fact have more than enough supply to meet the world's demand.
So before I let you go and off the hook here, thanks for all your time. This has been really interesting. So let's say I'm convinced by the fact that it would save taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars a year, just not paying more for U.S. blood than collecting it ourselves. And let's say I'm convinced even by nationalism. I don't like, we don't like shipping our oil down to the U.S. and then having Ontarians buy American oil. So why do we do that with blood? We should just collect our own blood and have enough there. Let's say I'm convinced by that. Where I think that you're going to run into people and their objection to it is the kind of people that you would attract to paid plasma clinics. So let me just give you a scenario. Right now you got Betty and Marjorie, their local pinochle club. They once a year, they go down to their community hall. When the blood drive's in town, they visit with each other. They donate their blood. They get a juice and a cookie, feel really good about helping their fellow Canadians. What they've seen out of the U.S., they've seen U.S. TV shows where, some, hungover college student or some homeless guy is highlighted as the main people who would donate their blood in the U.S. And they think to themselves, like, I really don't want to sit next to some stinky, unkempt homeless guy while I donate blood. I'm only going to go and do this if I get to sit next to Marjorie and see all my friends. So if it's people who are donating right now are the good community-minded people who will show up, but they think if it's paid, it's going to be desperate college students and homeless people who are going to sell their blood. Doesn't that, isn't in their mind mean that we're going to see? I know you've got your stats, but doesn't that mean that the people who are helping right now are going to be less inclined to help and therefore will be opposed to you changing the way that they are helping their community right now? Like, don't you think that's the real back of their head objection?
Yes, that is going to be. So I said the most important objection is the impact on unpaid blood donation. The second most important objection is the one that you just described. You're basically concerned about the possibility of wrongful exploitation in this area. So who's going to donate plasma? Let me go in order because I took some notes because you mentioned a pinochle club. What is a pinochle club?
It's like a card game. It's
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, sure. I should have just acted like I knew what that was. Okay, so one thing to be not glib about this, but one thing I might say is that the people at the Pinochle Club, if you go and you sell your plasma, you can then use those resources to improve your Pinochle Club. You can make selling your plasma. Yeah, you can make selling your plasma like part of the Pinochle Club, like the good that they do. Let me say this. Let me first begin by responding to the overall tone and suggestions buried in your question, because it comes up so frequently. And in fact, in the United States, if you just Google paid plasma, you'll find articles mostly from The Atlantic, right? That are like, oh, they're taking blood from the poor and so on. There is a stigma surrounding the selling of plasma that I would love to smash, right? Like, I would love for that stigma to end. It bothers me so much, and not just me, by the way. It bothers the patient groups that I speak to who consider every person that sells their plasma to be a hero. Like in the United States, the Immune Deficiency Foundation, I know the president of that organization, John. John is busy running a campaign that's like plasma donors are heroes as his effort to try to shatter this stigma amongst upper middle class and upper class people who look down their nose at people who sell their plasma. Patients who rely on plasma therapies think of plasma donors as bona fide heroes, right? Yes, they get paid. So what? So do nurses, right? Like nurses get paid for what they do. Do we think that they're any the less heroic because it's their profession or it's something that they do and they get money from? I'm a professor, right? I'm a teacher. I get paid for what I do. I have a salary that I draw on. Do I think that like teachers only ever teach in exchange for the money? Absolutely not. And hardly anybody thinks that. So we don't think that like it's impossible for a teacher to teach both because she thinks that like the world will be a better place and also because she's paid for it. We don't think that like a doctor, that her mission is only to make money rather than to save lives. No, we think it's possible for a doctor to both want to do something because there's money in it, but also for pro-social altruistic reasons. Why do we deny that kind of complicated multiple motives for people who sell their plasma? Why do we think we're not relying on any studies? We're relying on a stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't seen any studies on the motives of plasma donors. Okay, now let me kind of deal with the stereotype itself because it's really plausible, and it is true that plasma centers are located in poorer parts of the United States. They are located near universities and colleges in the United States, right? They are in those parts of the world, and it is true that like a lot of people do donate plasma in order to help make ends meet. You know, you can make $300 to $400 a month donating plasma, and that makes a big difference, right? Okay. One, it seems like this is a really good opportunity. If donating plasma were very risky, then I think you would have a real concern, but it is not. We encourage people to donate their plasma. I'm encouraging people listening to this podcast right now to go out and to donate their plasma for free at the Canadian Blood Services. You know, donate blood. You should. It's a good thing to do, and it's not very risky at all. So it's not very risky, and you get like $50. That sounds like a pretty good deal. It doesn't sound like exploitation. You make more money that way than you would from like a minimum wage. You make more for those like 1.5 to 2 hours than you would minimum wage. So that sounds like a good deal. If it were risky, it would be a very different discussion to have. In fact, I talked to a lot of professors. I'm a philosopher by training. I'm an ethicist. And it turns out that most of us, professionals that is, most of the people I've spoken to, they don't think paying people for plasma is exploitative at all, right? And I will end by I won't end because there's so much that was there in your question. But I will say this too. How do we improve the lot of people who are selling their plasma to like buy a birthday present for their kid or to purchase books that they need as a student? How do we make their lives better by making it illegal for them to do that? From their own perspective, this is the thing for them to do in order to make the ends meet, right? And then I come along and I say, and now it's illegal. Voluntary Blood Donations Act, it's illegal for you to do that. So what do I do to make ends meet? From my perspective, I have to go down my list of things that I can do in order to make money, from like selling plasma, which to me was like my best option, to like something else. I haven't fixed the situation. I've just buried the fact that there are people who need, there are poor people in Canada. And yeah, maybe people don't want to see them, right? Maybe we want to hide that fact, but we don't somehow replace the $50 that they make from selling plasma with like a $50 that they get from their local tree or something that they just walk up to. So I haven't improved their lot at all. One last thing about the homeless. You mentioned the homeless. Some people talk about the drug addicted. Mm-hmm. Those people are not permitted to sell their plasma anyways. This like story about homeless people selling their plasma is largely a myth. You are required to have a permanent home address. Every plasma collection center in the United States and in Canada not only looks at your the social security number in the US, the social insurance number in Canada, you need to provide that. You need to provide a permanent home address, and each of those plasma collection centers has a list of what you might describe as like flop houses or something like that. So like people can sometimes put down an address that isn't in fact a permanent home address, and you are deferred for those reasons. So if you are homeless, you can't sell plasma in the United States. If you are drug addicted, you also cannot sell your plasma. They do a physical, they check your blood, and you are not permitted to sell your plasma. So that is all a really long way of saying that like we should reconceive of the way that we think about people who sell their plasma. And we should think of those people as potentially heroic, because I have met now plenty of people who sell their plasma who do it because they know somebody who benefits from a plasma therapy. So they do it for all those warm, altruistic reasons. Yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
No, that's great. That's great. Okay, last thing, Peter. What can Canadians who are listening to this do to help improve the supply, get paid plasma in Canada? What can we do to push this along?
So there's a couple of things that you could do. I think maybe most importantly, you can write a letter to your local MLA. If you're listening in Alberta, you can write a letter to your MLA and tell him or her to support Tierney Yau's repeal bill. If you are in Ontario, you can write your local MPP, right? And tell your local MPP to consider repealing the Voluntary Blood Donations Act, right? We need to do that really quickly. So letter writing, pick up the phone, call your local politician, write an opinion piece. You can do that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Encourage the Canadian Taxpayers Federation to be public about this issue and to do more. Yeah. So those are each things that you can do. And you can pay attention to this issue as well. Oh, I should say you can also support the patient organizations. All of them in Canada, with the exception of the British Columbia Hemophilia Society, right? All of the other patient groups representing people who rely on plasma therapies, all of them are in favor of, they were all against banning paying for plasma, right? All of them. So you can support the Canadian Immunodeficiency Patient Organization, you can support the network of rare blood disorder organizations and so on.
Oh, it's fascinating. Okay. Well, thank you, Peter, for everything you're doing, for taking this task on when I don't think anyone else was taking it on, and turning it into, I think, what's coming to be a national debate on these things, and hopefully sooner rather than later, for the sake of all of the people that rely on these therapies. So thank you for doing that, and thanks for your time today. It's been fascinating.
Thank you for having me on, Scott. I had a great time.